first wave of nuclear power, and this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it.
This is the story of arguably one of the greatest human achievements in history. It's the story of long-term hard work, dedication, and failure that ultimately led to triumph. It's the story of Apollo 11, when man first walked on the moon, a scientific achievement rivaling many in our history, but an achievement of imagination all its own. Often, great achievement comes from great persistence, great difficulty, or great intellect. This one came from great urgency. The Cold War, which developed in 1947 as an outgrowth of World War II, is the name for the feud between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was more of a competition than a war, and one way in which the Soviet Union and the United States were competing was in space exploration. Like many competitions, it was called a race, the space race. The space race was a race to get men on the moon first. In seeking to achieve this, the US team experienced many misfortunes and struggles until the US ultimately triumphed on July 16, 1969. This is the story of that triumph. First, a bit of context on why the space race existed. The Cold War, which occurred after the Second World War, happened because the US and the Soviet Union each wanted to be seen as superior. There were many different conflicts in which the US and Soviet Union were on opposite sides of issues that arose starting in the late 1940s and into the early 1950s and 60s. These included the Korean War, the introduction and threat of nuclear weapons, the war of ideas in the media, and then the war in Southeast Asia. Now, one more bit of context. Space exploration is exciting to Americans. Americans have always explored. From the time when the first settlers landed at Plymouth Rock, Americans have pushed further into new territories. It's part of our philosophy as Americans to believe in exploration. And we have a pride in our space exploration, which, particularly in the 50s and 60s, was seen as the next territory to explore. The first tragedy from the American perspective and the unofficial start of the space race was on October 4th, 1957, when a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed into the Earth's orbit. Americans were surprised and shocked that the Soviet Union beat us into space with these firsts. On January 27, 1967, NASA engineers were ready to launch their first shuttle to space. This was called Apollo 1. During the launch rehearsal, there was a malfunction which started a deadly, quick-spreading cabin fire in the command center of the shuttle. This fire killed the 3 astronauts who were rehearsing, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee. This caused NASA to pause its work sending Americans into space, and for the next 5 missions, they chose to have unmanned operations to test various aspects of the Apollo program. Another side note is about the Gemini program. The Gemini missions were conducted in the 1960s to help NASA develop some of the skills needed for Apollo, and they were successful. Nancy Hall, an aerospace engineer at NASA Glenn Research Center, states, "Incremental steps were important for missions like these to help ensure success and not proceed too far down a path that may not work well." Note that the Gemini missions were incremental steps to Apollo and a key part of the moon program. For example, Gemini was conducted to learn how to dock a spacecraft, which was vital to the Apollo approach of having a separate landing craft from the capsule that returned to Earth. Also, an incremental approach enables one to accomplish something rather than have the competition make advancements while NASA appears to be doing nothing. The Gemini missions were actually little triumphs because the incremental steps taken boosted the learning for the Apollo program, and by 1966, the US was actually ahead of the Soviet Union in the space race. The next major failure was Apollo 6. This was the last unmanned mission to go into space and experienced 3 malfunctions. The malfunctions started almost immediately. 2 minutes into the flight, structural panels were lost from the lunar module adapter. After this, 2 of the 5 engines shut down prematurely, leading to the remaining 3 compensating for those 2 engines. When the engines needed to power up to propel Apollo 6 into orbit, they weren't able to. Apollo 6 plunged into the Pacific Ocean without having reached orbit. While this was a tragedy because it was the first Apollo mission since Apollo 1, which didn't go as planned, it was also a triumph on a small scale because it taught NASA important lessons. NASA engineers looked over flight control monitors and realized that the first failure in the structural panels resulted because of the honeycomb design that captured heat and pressure. On the following missions, precautions were taken by layering cork on the exterior to keep it cooler and drilling holes in the adapter to relieve pressure. Another opposition to the Apollo missions is unrelated to the actual NASA mission. What some people fail to realize is that the Apollo missions were not exactly popular.
With Whitey on the moon, her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. I can't pay no doctor bills, but Whitey's on the moon.
During the 1960s, a time of great social unrest, people protested the enormous amount of tax dollars being spent on the explorations. According to a USA Today poll done in 1979, only 47% of the United States community supported the missions. Most people did not believe that the amount of money being spent was appropriate for space exploration, nor did they support the missions. The convenient story we all know of how the Apollo missions brought together the country do not portray the truth of the citizens' views. On July 16, 1969, the Apollo 11 space shuttle was launched, and 4 days later, the seemingly impossible was achieved, when the first men landed on the moon. Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins were led by Neil Armstrong to be the first men in human history to successfully reach this goal. The national goal set by President John F. Kennedy had been completed, and the doubters were proved wrong. According to NASA's records, an estimated 530 million watched Armstrong's televised event and heard his voice as he described this event. One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Commemorative medallions bearing the names of the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts who lost their lives in a launchpad fire and 2 cosmonauts who also died in accidents were left on the moon's surface. The names of congressional and NASA leaders also stayed behind. Another triumph from Apollo 11 was the new learning we gained as a result of the success of the mission. Analysis of materials gathered from the surface of the moon confirmed that there was no evidence of living organisms, fossils, or native compounds upon the moon. Rocks on the moon's surface hint of an ancient magnetic force, although there is currently not one. Armstrong stated that the top layer of the moon was a powdery substance, but once he tried to dig 5 to 6 inches down, he reached a hard, cohesive material. Later, scientists working with NASA determined the Earth and the Moon are genetically related, formed from different proportions of common materials. A lasting legacy of Apollo 11 is that each future moon landing will include gathering new materials for conducting scientific experiments in order to advance our learnings. The last triumph is cultural. This flight rekindled the excitement Americans felt for space exploration and as nationalists, but it also inspired people around the world. An ecstatic reaction enveloped the globe as everyone shared in the success of this mission. Ticker tape parades, speaking engagements, public relation events, and a world tour by the astronauts helped to create goodwill both in the United States and abroad. This also created support for more and faster space exploration and scientific discovery. 5 more landing missions followed at approximately 6-month intervals through December 1972, each of them increasing the time spent on the moon. 3 of the later Apollo missions used a lunar rover vehicle to travel in the vicinity of the landing site, but none of them equaled the excitement and intensity of Apollo 11. The success of the Apollo 11 mission proved that the United States was the most powerful and triumphant of nations in that time period and set the stage for United States world leadership for years to come. It created pride among Americans, became something everyone was proud of, and brought Americans together at a time when many other political, economic, and social tensions drove many people apart. But the real triumph and legacy of the Apollo missions, a legacy that is just as powerful today, 50 years later, is if humans are willing to dedicate time and hard work, to take big risks, to fail, and to take unpopular actions, they can achieve seemingly impossible things.